Hi, Chip Moldenhauer, founder, CEO, Arbo.
I'm Tricia Curtis, I'm the CEO of Petronerds. Energy transportation is one of the single biggest controversial things next to energy production in the US, but I think the transportation of energy is, I would say, a pretty focal point of controversy right now. Not for pipelines that actually exist and the ability to actually build another pipeline or infrastructure of whether it's oil or gas.
Yep.
But in terms of Dakota Access Pipeline, I think it's definitely a focal point. It's certainly something I would like to discuss and get into with you, given it's the topic of this conversation. But just broadly, how do you think the Dakota Access Pipeline fits into this, this microcosm of energy controversy, of the transportation of energy controversy?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We get the question often with respect to is another long haul major midstream transportation project going to be built, and what are project developers doing in this time when you have projects not just Dakota Access Pipeline, but you have a year where the Atlantic Coast Pipeline project was canceled. We went to the oral arguments for that project. In fact, back to DAPL as a project, we had someone at every single hearing for the Dakota Access Pipeline project. But it's been more, like we were talking a little bit about before, it's been a bit of a symptom of a broader problem. And I think as we kind of look forward, most of our customers that are in the pipeline and midstream space are focused on modernization programs. As you look at aging pipelines, aging assets, and are there ways to recoup investments and investments back into the rate base with respect to integrity of ongoing systems. But as we were talking a little bit about before, DAPL is probably one of the first. It was the first kind of shoe to drop with respect to a circumstance where you had a pipeline that was built, a pipeline that's flowing, and the risk that there was in fact no finality, right? So, and typically you would expect once it's gone through the court system to not be re-litigated again. At least that was an expectation, as you probably have in your representations of other customers. And now that old assumption in a world we live in where assumptions are being squashed like kind of whack-a-moles, like that old game on an almost daily basis. We're seeing that play out on the gas infrastructure side as well. There was, as recent as last week, the new FERC commissioners threw a new wrench into a project that has been certificated for 4 or so years. It calls into question the finality of projects on the gas side. But specifically with respect to the Dakota Access Pipeline, I think even if you were to ask Energy Transfer, what happens next, I think they would probably punt and say it's largely up to the courts, and that's the big X factor. So we do at our business a lot of the time is trying to combine the data where you have these kind of operational risk management decisions. So if you're a shipper and you're flowing product on a DAPL right now and you have an issue like this occur, how do you plan for other alternatives? What are the rates? What are the other paths to market? What's it going to cost? But then ultimately inform it with lawyers that know the industry and also know the litigation front, which is unfortunately a bigger and growing part of the risk dynamics that we have.
But how do you quantify? So I think your business, you clarified that it quantifies that regulatory risk, and it also, and then you sort of have, as it's aptly called Arbo, you're also looking at the arbitrage, and you're basically doing this cool sort of crude marketing dynamic.
Yep.
But I think that I would say now, I think what's old is new again. And I mean, in my career, I've been in this business since, I was 24, and it's basically 10 years of doing this. And it's kind of amazing that, Keystone XL was 10 years old, that, it finally has been axed. But oil sands were coming online, Bakken crude was coming online, and it was really important to understand how crude infrastructure was being developed, what type of crude it was, what pipelines it went in, how it went to market. Everybody was sort of learning this as it was happening.
Right.
And now that's all super relevant again, because it's not just Dakota Access Pipeline, but Enbridge Line 5, which takes, very similar pipeline capacity, actually over 500,000 barrels a day, that's going into the Midwest, and also propane. And you have folks wanting to empty that pipeline. So this is the first time we've actually dealt with pipelines not just getting canceled or not built, but actual pipelines that are flowing being emptied, and that creates a whole new dynamic. And you guys are quantifying that risk and then trying to also figure out what the existing solutions, so that would be the other pipeline systems out of North Dakota, out of the Wilson Basin to get to market?
Right, yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, when When I founded the business, it was all about prediction and timing of infrastructure projects, and a lot of that data is tied up in unstructured permitting and other regulatory data sets. But what we realized after several years is that data can only take you so far. At a certain point, it goes into the court system, it goes into the sausage making of regulatory agencies, and you need someone that really understands the data, but also understands how those regulatory agencies and has some experience with the court systems to be able to provide an informed viewpoint, and DAPL's a great example of that. Not everything can be quantified with data. Once it gets into the court systems, very few people can say exactly what the outcome will be. We've tried to inform that by having lawyers that actually attend all the hearings, having folks that actually come from the industry, because oftentimes we have folks that are analyzing court cases that actually have never practiced law, and then they also have not practiced law, and then they don't have any background in the industry, and that's generally going to lead to what we think to be sort of an uninformed viewpoint. But
it is unprecedented to empty a pipeline, basically.
Yeah, completely unprecedented. I think getting a little bit into some of the weeds on DAPL, which we'd probably spend a whole podcast on. I think at this point it's a matter of negotiation, whether the company wants to negotiate with the Biden administration or the Army Corps on some measures that would be deemed to be satisfactory, some reduction in pressure, anything to perhaps prevent any sort of catastrophic failure related to the pipeline. But I think the initial notion under the Trump administration that the project would have an EIS done by the end of the year is probably, most prognosticators and including our research team would probably say that's probably not going to be the case. But again, you got a time window now between now and April for a lot of that, kind of behind the scenes, deal making, if you will, to occur. Otherwise, to your point from before, it's going to be left up to Judge Boasberg, who's been with this case since it was a project. He was actually, when I was in law school, he was my mock trial judge.
I read that.
So it was
That's
funny.
very interesting.
It was funny. The first time we decided to send lawyers to the project when it was going through some of its permitting issues, I think I recognize this guy from somewhere. But he's a great guy, and I think most people would say he's a very measured judge, but there's been measured judges make decisions that are different than what the market thinks at times. So I think it would seem to me that there want to be some deal that's made ahead of time, or risk the uncertainty of a ruling in April that goes a direction that perhaps the company and the shippers and the market doesn't want.
But the market, given your sort of the Arbo side and that stuff, you're seeing some of that stuff play out now, right? Because from my understanding, you actually are, the shipper commitments or the credits that they were given over the summer, they're using those, and the Dakota Access Pipeline is running full. And if I'm analyzing that from a market perspective, I personally think that the risk that this pipeline is going to be emptied, and I do get asked this, like how high, and I think it's much, much higher than it was before this administration was in office. Because if indeed the Keystone XL was a sort of symbolic gesture, this could be another very large symbolic gesture. Right. Unprecedented, but it just seemed like the market is, people are using those credits. Dakota Access is running pretty full. And I think a lot of folks, I'm not sure, really appreciate the importance of this pipeline, of the route. And like, as a true, petro nerd, I love that, this pipeline went from North Dakota to Patoka, Illinois, and Patoka, Illinois, bypassing Cushing, Oklahoma, your major center point, and then going to the Gulf Coast and hitting those refineries that really, really like this light sweet crude. And it was just a perfect match for these less complex refineries without cokers, and so it works really well. So for this to be, the market seems like it's running full, which is sort of a bet, or at least a hedge by some operators, that they may not have access to this pipeline later, and then all the crude is going to be stuck in Wyoming.
Right, and on top of that, you have an expansion project on top of DAPL that's been waiting. That's, from what we hear, is has commitments and is
I
ready.
Think
Is fully committed. So to your point, you certainly have market demand for that, which raises the risk. I think to your point from before, any sort of shutdown or any sort of reduction in operating pressure is not going to be something that's well received by the market. But I think kind of where we started, it certainly was a tea leaf or domino that seems to be moving in the direction of there really is no certainty around transportation or infrastructure assets being built, which why focus on transportation? I think at a certain point in time, we could probably 2 years from now be sitting here talking about renewable energy projects, because oftentimes people forget that no matter what infrastructure you're building, it's going to have an environmental impact. It's going to have an environmental footprint, and arguments can be made on both sides as to looking at migratory bird trends, or is there an endangered species in an area. You see now those same environmental groups are pipeline projects appearing in the same proceedings in Virginia when it comes to renewable energy projects. So,
I think not in my backyard NIMBYism that both the wind and solar guys typically actually have to do with when they actually have to build those facilities near people's homes.
Right, and it's a not in my backyard, and a lot of it is very ideological, even outside of the not in my backyard groups. I think there are the industry is getting smarter, our customers as well, on engaging with the right NGOs at the right time. We talked a little bit about ESG before, and I think that's an area where the industry can start talking a little bit more about cleaner and how do we get there. And I think there's ways the industry could be more transparent with their data sets and develop metrics in line with the NGOs. I mean, EDF is a great example of an NGO that is very pro-environment, but seems to be a little bit more market neutral, perhaps than others. But I think those coordinations is in a much more integrated way is the path forward for the industry. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to meet roadblocks, and transportation constraints are just one of them.
I think the market probably has to align a little bit in understanding where reality is, though, and where one, that these operators need to be doing, operators, or whether you're in midstream or upstream, that you're doing more than actually virtue signaling, that you're actually doing it, and that you can do it, and it makes sense for your business, and it makes economic sense, and it increases reliability and all these things, and then also that the market appreciates and understands that producing whether it's a renewable piece of energy or whether it's from hydrocarbons, that it actually is providing a source of energy, has a BTU content to it, and it can actually do something, and that how the two work. And I think right now, to me, that seems to be a pretty big disconnect in Wall Street from what ESG has talked about and what it is, and what and actually producing energy that's demanded and needed, and actually the storm sort of catalyzed this and put it into focus. But I think actually pipelines, the reality of Dakota Access Pipeline was pulled out of service, the market ramifications are so significant in terms of how much crude then has to go into different places, and how it's finding homes and how it's getting there. And I think you'd have some people probably say, well, technically you have over 800,000 barrels a day of nameplate capacity that's out there, so it should be okay. But not all pipelines are created equal, not all markets are created equal, and essentially you have some pipelines that aren't running full right now. So it's just not going to work that way. And the same thing goes if you take out Enbridge Line 5. I mean, you're going to have massive disruptions in how product moves. Yeah,
I was describing this of elementary school kids. I was trying to describe our software product to them recently, and I said, Daddy's going to fly to Houston. And it's really easy. I go into this software platform and I click here from DCA or Baltimore or Washington to Hobby Airport. And look, it shows me what the rate is. It shows me the paths to get there. They've changed a little bit since COVID. And I was saying kind of what we've created with respect to liquids markets is the ability to have kind of a kayak, if you will, for oil pipelines.
Yeah, I love the way you guys describe that.
It's just way more complex than now you got to talk about the grade of crude. Are we talking NGLs? We do a lot of work on the gas markets as well, and then the transportation rate. You're talking about a lot of some overlapping customers on Wall Street. They always want one rate, to put in kind of a cell. But when you're talking about transporting liquids products, there's committed, there's walk-up rates, there's all kinds of surcharges, et cetera. We've digitized that all into the platform such that you can say, from kind of an operational risk management side, you can say, if this goes down, I need flow assurance of my product if I'm a producer. I need to be able to get from point A to point B. What's it going to cost? Can I go by truck? If I ultimately have to go, there is no pipeline opportunity. I have to go by rail or truck. What's that going to cost? What's it going to cost if I'm on a pipe? Can I use that to look for opportunities as well? Back to kind of the naming of Arbo being focused on finding arbitrage opportunities more quickly. And that's as a software company, always focus on trying to innovate for the individual. So the scheduler, the originator, what we think about every day is how do we make their life much better? Our head of sales says I want to make your life so you can go home earlier. At the end of the day.
Can I ask a hard question? Sure. Can you get rid of a crude marketer, or are you enabling the crude marketer? Because crude marketing I think it's an awesome, fun, underappreciated business. And it seems like your tool can really enable them to just go crush it, because they have all this data at their fingertips and they can understand the different markets, and they could probably capture on, really seizing an opportunity. I mean, I don't think if you're a North Dakota producer, you should be freaking out. But there's ways
Right.
to really analyze and figure this out of like, how can I be the first mover? How can I work, with obviously certain companies are going to do better than others, but it seems like this is something that can really empower crude marketers as opposed to just let's fire the crude marketer and then buy this product.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, the product was informed by some of the leading pure play crude marketers when we had it in beta, because we made a decision in April, which at the time was somewhat contrarian, to say, hey, we're gonna double down our capital in the year and start investing on this product that was already in development. And we did that in concert with crude marketers, producers who are in a marketing role, because if you look at the energy value chain, as you well know, there's always a marketing, there's a fundamental analyst function, and there's a commercial function at each kind of node as you go through the otherwise linear process, which is far more complex than probably most would appreciate, but in ways that will make their life a lot easier. And I think at the end of the day, it'll make it's just like wealth advising, right? Everyone said with all these robo-advisors at the end of the day, well, we won't need wealth advisory services anymore. Well, they've gone up actually dramatically since the advent of the robo-advisors. So to the extent we make the marketing job easier, they're utilizing assets more efficiently. We think that's better for their role, but also better for the environment, and hopefully better for the energy transition. We start talking about cleaner, better utilized assets.
And I would say that I would think that on a micro scale, that stuff can only, every part of this business, and I think this actually gets to this whole Evolve conference and the evolution of oil and gas, but every part of this business actually has to be working to reduce costs and to run more efficiently and to be doing things. And I think a lot of things actually, while many midstream companies are ahead of the curve, many aren't. It is still an old, in many sense, antiquated business, and a lot of old midstream operators, and sort of they've just gotten by with how things are. And you have to be really nimble and flexible, especially with massive regulatory uncertainty, and even just changes with the regulatory uncertainty that could be impacting upstream production is going to have an impact on the midstream. And so if you have reductions in production on federal land, that's going to have a whole cascading impact on the midstream side. Yeah,
totally. And I think you layer on top of that, you have an aging workforce in the industry. But you have, from what we, interact with, very tech savvy, entrepreneurial, customers who are used to using platforms, and that kind of crew change, as some refer to it, is underway. And I think you need to enable them with the tools to be able to do their job. And they're turning for inspiration because they grew up in a mobile, highly digitized world. They're turning to platforms to say, well, why isn't this information transparent? Why can't I know what the transportation rate is between point A and point B? Why can't I know who the counterparties are on this specific pipeline? It should be available. The market would operate more efficiently. I think we have countless examples just in the past year of signs that the physical energy market is not operating as efficiently as it should be, and could be far more integrated. And it's only getting more complex, right? We have pipeline companies that have renewable energy groups. The notion of that when I founded the business 6 years ago would be that is the most outlier data point that could ever occur. Why would a pipeline company have a renewable group? Well, they're thinking about opportunities to clean portfolio. They're looking at opportunities to integrate with solar, power compressor stations.
That's just a renewable group. It's like Enbridge has like a renewable company. It's basically like a renewable component to their company. And they've been way actually ahead of the curve on this. They were doing this 10 years ago when I was visiting with them in DC. They were doing this a long time ago to work on their footprint.
Yeah, we've worked with Enbridge for a long time. Yeah, they are, and they even have an innovation lab, a group of individuals they're trying to foster sort of that next generation workforce. They are hiring more computer scientists, more data scientists, et cetera. And that's really fun for our team, because then we could start innovating together, right? And then it comes, its own sort of organic, kind of incubator. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that change emerges, because there is a growing massive talent pool, take here in Houston and where we're sitting right now of startups and people that want to get into the industry, and they're trying to find that right foothold. And unfortunately, it needs to be more, for some of the people that have been in the industry longer, it needs to be more tech driven, more data focused. You spend a lot of your days in the data, and then part of the problem our customers find is they have data coming from them from all different sources, like data overload. No one needs a new data, but people need it integrated into their workflow to drive at an integrated solution. And that's unfortunately sort of the paradigm that we're in right now. So we're trying to build products that are inspired by the consumer side, because that's the world that our users have grown up in, a far more mobile world.
Who is mainly, because I think about this my clients are, and the answers I provide is that people are inundated with data. So people always say, well, is your data, I'm like, I don't care how good the data is. You can do a lot with crappy data. You can do a lot with great
Right.
data. It really is, you still have to have analysts who understand it. And actually you can quantify it, you can have bots, you can do all kinds of algorithms, and that's great. But at the end of the day, you still have to have people that understand it and can actually work with clients and customers to interpret it and tell them what they need and what they don't need. So I imagine that, when I come to you, do I buy all of it? Or can I just say, I just need this? Or you can help me decide what I need if I'm a midstream player. And I can say, I've got somebody on the marketing side. Is it one package or is it a suite of everything?
Yeah, we've transitioned from initially like an enterprise, kind of sale where things are bundled together and then unbundled in different ways, more to a sort of end user based, like you get value from the service and almost a freemium opportunity, and then it scales, over time as you find more and more value, you get different features and functionalities, that occur. And we found that having the advisory component on top of it, like typically people in the tech industry outside of energy would say advisory. Well, why do you need to have advisory involved? And it's specifically to your point right there. Oftentimes the data will only take you up so far, and then you need to hop on a phone and say, hey, I can get my product to Nederland, but I'm thinking about this, and they want to talk to someone that was a crude trader, crude analyst, et cetera. And we found with hiring people that have that type of background, like we have several amazing folks that come with crude marketing backgrounds that are on our team, they're able to also help inform product development so that when the algorithm spits out something, when it's in a beta early stage phase, you could say, from a quality standpoint, that was right that the algorithm worked that way, but the answer wasn't informed by the right variable or the data needs to be adjusted. So I think it's both from a product standpoint, and then we also sell the additional kind of advisory services on top of it.
So I want to ask a harder question then, because this topic is on, Dakota Access Pipeline and the next evolution of transportation. And I think, so you could sell this data and you can sell this information, and I mean, it's awesome to have it and everything, but you still have to, we were talking originally quantifying risk.
Right.
So if I'm on a higher level here and I'm looking at more of the macro and I'd say, well, I want to know, what is the likelihood then Dakota Access Pipeline gets emptied? What is the likelihood that, Enbridge Line 5 gets emptied? And obviously there's just, so many repercussions along the whole value chain of crude oil that is going to impact that. And that to that end, what's the likelihood that, there are regulatory risks on federal land then impacts things on the midstream side. And then if you have one of these legal unprecedented. So, how much of that is you're quantifying, you're putting, how much of that is the computer side and the algorithm versus how much of that's you just sort of putting your gut into it as well?
Well, for DAPL, we're on one side of it. We're on more of the, I wouldn't call it the gut, but more of the interpretation from a lawyer who was a general counsel at a pipeline company, who spent 30 years of his career, interpreting just this type of event. And then, what clients will typically ask us is, well, show us your track record. And we can show them a track record because we've quantified, the outcome, be it through our own judgment or through our own data, and can show performance over time, which is typically, for others that are kind of in the space and trying to quantify what sometimes seems like the unquantifiable, they can't prove a track record behind it. And now that we've been in business 6 years, we can say, we've been tracking this project since the first day it was an idea. You take Mountain Valley Pipeline, that project was originally generated through our initial data to inform some initial permitting decisions when it was even before it got filed. So I think the legacy that we've been involved with a lot of the projects from the beginning has been helpful. That plus the industry expertise on top of it. But yeah, it depends on how you define kind of the macro, I guess.
So if we're speaking frankly though, and this is if we're talking about the evolution, I would say that there's two very different outcomes for the evolution of transportation, not just of oil and gas, but for energy. If basically the decision on Dakota Access, I think, could impact the decision on Line 5, and would be sort of this precedent. And if the administration does lean in, it doesn't. If they push against this and they actually empty this pipeline, it's game changing for the entire industry. And the evolution of transportation is then set by that. And so everything sort of cascades around it. Whereas if this does not get emptied, it means that while I don't think there's any new major pipelines that are going to get built, it does mean that maybe some smaller pipelines can get built, and that your existing systems, to your point, can function better and more efficiently, and that things can be run. And there probably is I know there is a lot of opportunities, on the midstream side to really run things more smoothly, more efficiently, and do a better job in the this sort of older system. But it also just means, just on the face of it, that you're not going to be able to build much, that you're not going to add much new pipe. And that's going to be highly problematic when you still have to add energy supplies into the system.
And think about it from the other side. If you're now operating pipelines, you now have an entirely new risk premium that you need to bake into your ROE, right? So if for example, on the gas side, let's take some regulated assets, you have a decision that says, hey, a pipeline that's been in service for X period of time, now it's shrouded with mystery as to whether this pipeline is going to continue to be able to flow molecules. That adds a whole new risk premium to all the other projects that are currently pending, and perhaps that ROE should be higher than initially thought. So now this all loops in with operational issues at the regulatory side, where there might be justification for ROEs well beyond 15, 16, 17%. And I think no one's really fully thinking through those issues. And I think that's a little, I'm from DC, live 3 blocks from the Capitol, and it's oftentimes frustrating that there's less of a holistic view of the energy market that's taken with respect to some of these issues, because oftentimes they've become, they're an ideology for someone that's anti-project. So we see that a lot at FERC right now. It's unknown what the current chairman would vote for with respect to a project. To your point about this being sort of a leading indicator or a cascading issue over time.
I lived and worked in DC as well, and I can tell you that, and I literally cut my teeth on Canadian oil sands and Bakken crude production, and it was Keystone XL at the time before anyone knew about it. And I could say that even under the Obama administration, there wasn't a holistic understanding or view. And really, it didn't actually become a controversial element. Keystone XL didn't, until it was sort of brought about by some local communities. And then I believe Obama stepped in he got on a radio show in Nebraska. And that was how he sort of dipped his toe into the water, and then it sort of went out of, it ballooned and it snowballed, but it wasn't a big issue. So it was something that I liken it back to, like, thinking about Norway and thinking about Australia and a lot of these countries that fully embrace climate change and ESG and these movements, and have been actually big movers on it in terms of safety and everything. A country like Norway is perfect, but they also drill for oil and gas, and they also transport it, and they have a very efficient system to do that. And yet we seem to have a harder time in North America with the production and consumption of crude oil, and then this new element, which it is relatively new, to be opposing transportation. And the other thing I dealt with in DC was the crude by rail accidents, because crude by rail was surging, and that's a whole another element to this. Do you guys also deal on the crude by rail side, on the optionality for that, and also the risk profile of that as well?
More so on the electric transmission side, less so on the crude by rail. But you got me thinking about transportation and other domains, because where this starts or has started with DAPL, and then perhaps it continues with respect to other pipeline projects, I think we're going to see similar issues with respect to electric transmission. So there's, let's say 20 some odd gigawatts of renewable energy. That renewable energy needs to get connected to the grid. That's all done through a state-based and very regional permitting process. That's a patchwork that may not necessarily be the outcome the current administration is looking for. And I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to think that at some point in time there's going to be a push, probably sooner rather than later, for federal regulation of how electric transmission is permitted. And whether that ultimately gets folded under FERC, then you're going to start seeing the same transportation issues we're talking about right now. I guarantee we'll be talking about it with respect to electric transmission. I mean, that was an issue in 08, 09 when big money was put in to the various wind power efforts in Oklahoma, and then the realization that, oh my God, we can't connect it actually efficiently to the grid. That perhaps the Federal Power Act gets electric transmission folded back within it, but it'll be interesting to see how that could transpire. And we have heard some of the new FERC commissioners talk about that, and the fact that they're even talking about it, for us is a sign.
And I think within the executive order on climate change, because of how much wind and how much power is actually mentioned, it seems like it has to be, because the administration is now taking with executive orders, and multiple of them mentioning power and wind, is taking a foothold to say, we want to take our federal land and we want to XYZ so much of it to be, putting renewable power. But the problem is that you can just say, okay, well, now we'll accelerate offshore wind development on the East Coast, but then that has massive power that has to be taken into the grid. And they don't have, the Northeast doesn't have the adequate systems necessarily to take on that surge of power in a reliable fashion. And, your whole profile, I think, could be cascaded into, because they have a nuclear power plant that looks like it's going to be decommissioned in New York. And so in theory, those things are going to be very chunky, and FERC looks like they will have to probably get involved in some manner.
I worked on that nuclear power plant, the relicensing. But yeah, I mean, but I think you speak to the point. They're complex issues, and you got to also be a little bit careful of what you wish for, right? Yeah. If you're anti-transportation on, let's say the oil side for whatever the reasons may be, these issues are going to crop up again when you start building, a 1,000-mile, long electric transmission that ties together various renewable assets, to the grid. That is going to have the same level of opposition, I would imagine, as a lot of these, oil and natural gas projects have had.
And I would say the tie-in is actually that I explain to folks and clients a lot is that your renewables and uptaking on the grid and the ability to produce natural gas and to transport natural gas is intrinsically linked together. And that a lot of these renewables just will not be able to have the uptake without that natural gas being uptaked. And with transportation at risk for some of this, both the upstream and the midstream side, there's some serious issues that could get really hairy and really messy with it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also on the natural gas side, you're going to see producers that are coming out and are transparent with their data, that are saying, listen, we are getting cleaner. And what's driving demand for our product is the end user utility. Yep. Utility wants to be able to show that to its Public Utility Commission that, hey, our products that we're using to heat homes, provide electricity are in fact cleaner. Is there a way to incentivize that? Almost like buying local produce. You're going to pay a little bit more for that gas that's cleaner at the end of the day. It's going to drive policy initiatives. Does that become part of the dialogue, or are the people that are so anti-natural gas going to say, I don't even want to hear it, right? And I think a lot of that is going to be driven. If we were having this conversation 4 years ago, it would be about what's supply being pushed to market. They're the drivers of the current market. Right now we're living in a very demand-driven world. Whether it's here at the LDC and utility level, or is it that gas going overseas, which I think is part of the broader narrative the industry could have towards, hey, we're doing a lot for the world with respect to greenhouse gas emissions going down in areas that didn't have electricity to start with, and now they do, and it's powered by power plants or powered by natural gas, or they were largely oil or coal-based power, and now we're weaning them off of what otherwise is a dirtier fuel. That's a great narrative that I think people should pay attention to. Well,
I think, and we can probably can wrap it up and close this, but I think that bringing this back to that production of natural gas and that transportation of natural gas and that ability to export it, it still comes back to this concept that ESG, how Wall Street thinks of this, how the world understands data and appreciates the actual production of these commodities, whether we're talking about fossil fuels or we're talking about renewables, how energy actually works, how transportation works. It's critical to really understanding that you can't just, it's not a green leaf that pops out of the ground. You just pick it, and it turns our lights on. That, the most renewable types of energy have a transportation system that goes with it. And it's very complex and it's very interwoven. And, the production of, we are powering, exporting 11 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas, and the ability to continue to do that has changed. It's reduced our greenhouse gas emissions considerably in the U.S., but it's also reducing profiles for our Asian allies and European allies as well, and has considerable consequences if those pipelines that infrastructure cannot get built.
Well said.